And housing aren't the only things families could be paying more for. Wisconsin Public Service now proposing the electric and natural gas rate hikes in 2025 and 2026. They marked the final public hearing session about that increase. Those who spoke at tonight's meeting advised against the increase because of the rise everyone else has already seen in other places. Some suggesting different approaches to the situation, like having a tiered rate system where the more people use, the more they pay, and having those with higher usage receive bigger hikes. WPS officials say the vast majority of what the extra funds would be used for is to cover costs of renewable energy projects and power plants that have already been approved.